we have discussed the derivation of the IS curve, and if you recall, we said the IS curve is a combination of GDP and interest rate, different combinations of GDP and interest rate, so that the goods market is in equilibrium. And the goods market equilibrium was characterized by the equality between income and planned expenditure. It was alternatively represented as when actual investment is equal to planned investment. It also depicted the equilibrium between saving and investment. Now, what is happening in the, if this is the IS curve, we are saying at each point on the IS curve, it is a combination of GDP and interest rate, so that saving is equal to investment. Now, if you are on the IS curve, this point, the condition S is equal to I is achieved. Now, suppose you are not at you are not at a point which is on the IS curve, but you are at a point which is to the right of the IS curve. Let it be point A. Now, certainly at A, saving will not be equal to investment because you are not on the IS curve. What will happen at point A? We can get to know what will happen to the relationship between saving and investment if we consider a point on the IS curve with reference to point A, and let it be point B. Now, and this corresponds to income level of Y1, whereas point B was corresponding to a interest rate of R1, and point A corresponded to a interest rate of R2. Please recall that saving is a function of income and it depends on income positively, whereas investment is a negative function of interest rate. So at point A and B, we are finding income level is same, so saving is same. Saving is same at A and B, at B, A and B, but interest rate is relatively higher at point A, which is leading to a lower investment as compared to point B. So which I will, or I can represent as saving as greater than investment, because saving is same at A and B, but investment is relatively low at A compared to point B, because point A is representing a higher interest rate. I hope you got it. Now we can see what is happening at point A with reference to another point, say point T on the IS curve. If you compare point A and T, what you are finding? Both at point A and T, interest rate is same, which is R2, but T corresponds to a relatively lesser level of GDP. Now, because T corresponds to a lesser level of GDP, the savings, which is a function of income, will be relatively low at T compared to point A, which corresponds to a higher level of GDP. So investment remaining same, again we are finding savings at A, because it corresponds to a higher level of income, will be higher than point T, because investment is same at both A and T. And if we consider a point which is to the left of the IS curve, say point Z, what is happening at point Z? Both B and Z have the same. Suppose I am analyzing with reference to point B on the IS curve. Both at point Z and B, the interest rate is same, but Z corresponds to a lower level of GDP. So investment remaining what it is at B and Z, savings will be now relatively S at point Z. So here to the left of IS curve, I will get now the same thing. If I consider point T on the IS curve and compare it with point Z, what I am getting, both at T and Z, income level is same, so savings will be the same at both T and Z, but interest rate is relatively low at R1. So because interest rate is relatively low, investment will be relatively higher at R1 compared to R2 interest rate. So that will imply that investment is greater than savings at point Z compared to point T, which in other words is, if investment is greater than savings, saving is less than investment. Now consider a point which is on the LM curve. The points on the LM curve are so derived that at each point money demand is equal to money supply. So my LM curve was looking like this, where R and GDP Y. If you see, if that means that LM curve implies money demand is equal to money supply. Okay, and money demand had two components, which is transaction demand plus non-transaction demand for money, which was a function of income and a positive function income, and this was a negative function of interest rate. So if I consider a point like A to the right of the LM curve, I can see what is happening at A if I consider a point on the LM curve which is with reference to point A on the vertical axis. So both A and B, if you see, are representing the same level of income, but A corresponds to a relatively lower interest rate compared to B. And because interest rate is inversely related, or the non-transaction demand for money is inversely related to the to the interest rate, here at point A, money demand for non-transaction purposes at A will be greater than money demanded for non-transaction purpose at B. So nothing has changed for the transaction demand for money because both A and B correspond to the same level of income. So MT and MNT will be what is at point A will be greater than MT and plus MNT at point B. So what we are finding, money demand at point A will be greater than the money demand at point B, and nothing has changed to the money supply. So what we will find, money supply remaining same. Now money demand is greater than money supply because one component of demand for money is higher at A, and the other component, which is depending on income, is same both at A and B. Now if you consider point T on the LM curve and see what is happening to A and T at point A and T, both A and T correspond to the same interest rate. Now T correspond to a relatively lower level of income, and by the same logic A correspond to a higher level of GDP, and being a higher level of GDP at A compared to point T, the transaction demand for money will be relatively higher. So the transaction demand for money at A is greater than the transaction demand for money at point T. Okay, so and what is happening to the non-transaction demand for money, because interest rate is same at both A and T, the non-transaction demand for money will be same at A and point T. So at point A, in total we are finding one component of demand for money is higher, so the total demand for money will be higher at point A compared to point T, whereas money supply is remaining the same. So money demand will be greater than money supply to the right of the LM curve. Now you may consider a point, suppose Z, which is to the left of the LM curve. What is happening, both Z and T correspond to the same interest rate, but Z now corresponds to a still lower level of GDP, say Y3. So the transaction demand for money the transaction demand for money at point Z will be relatively less than the transaction demand for money at point T. Please do not confuse this T with this the superscript T with the subscript T. T just I have chosen a point, but the superscript T is referring to the money demanded for transaction purpose. Now, because Z is corresponding to a relatively lower level of GDP, the transaction demand for money at Z will be relatively less compared to the transaction demand for money at point T. So the total demand for money um, will be relatively less than the money supply. Why? Because the other component of demand for money, the non-transaction demand for money at Z and T, is the same, and we are saying the money supply, nothing has changed to it. I hope this is now clear. We can also take a point for the sake of completion, say point L. At point L, what is happening? If you consider point L with reference to say point say L with reference to point N, what is happening? N is on the LM curve, but L is not, and both L and N correspond to the same level of income. So transaction demand for money is same both at point N and point L. But the non-transaction demand for money, which inversely depends on interest rate, will be relatively low at point L, which corresponds to a relatively higher rate of interest compared to point N. So my total demand for money will be less than money supply at point L. So we are getting in the LM curve to the, so if my LM curve is like this, to the right of the LM curve I get money demand is greater than MS. To the left of the LM curve I am getting money demand is less than MS. And when money demand is greater than MS, what will happen? Interest rate will have a tendency to go up. And when money demand is less than money supply, what will happen? Interest rate will have a tendency to go down. Now, if you compare what was happening in the IS curve, so this was my IS curve. To the right of the IS curve, I was getting saving is greater than investment, and to the left it was saving was less than investment. Now, when saving is greater than investment, what will happen? People are not consuming as much, so that is leading to unwanted inventory accumulation. So producers will have a tendency to reduce output, so output will have a tendency to go down. Now when savings are less than investment, which in other words means investment is more than savings, this will lead to a situation where people are spending a lot, and which is which will lead to a increase in GDP. Okay, because when people are spending a lot, firms have a tendency to increase output. So after having agreed that the IS curve is representing what? IS curve is representing, to the right it is S is greater than I, to the left it is less than I, and LM curve, to the right it is MD is greater than MS and MD is less than MS on the left of the LM curve. And we know that when MD is greater than MS, out interest rate will have a tendency to go up. When MD is less than MS, interest rate will have a tendency to go down. When saving is greater than investment, output will have a tendency to fall. When saving is less than investment, output will have a tendency to increase. Okay, I have just put whatever we had done earlier at one place. What is the purpose of doing all this? We know that the economy achieves simultaneous equilibrium in the goods market and in the money market when the IS curve and the LM curve intersect. Okay, This is my IS curve, this is my LM curve. So the economy is in simultaneous equilibrium in the goods market and money market at point A. But suppose you are not at point A, if you are at a disequilibrium point, maybe you are in this quadrant 1, or you happen yourself to be in, you happen to find yourself in quadrant 2, or in say quadrant 3, or in quadrant 4. We want to know how the system will adjust, or how the system will move from these disequilibrium points to the equilibrium point. And to know that, I have to find out what is happening to saving and investment in each quadrant, and what is happening to money demand and money supply in each quadrant. So in to the right of the IS curve, I know saving is greater than investment. So here also saving will be greater than investment. Here saving will be less than investment. Here also saving is less than investment in quadrant 3. Now to the right of LM curve, I get MD is greater than MS. I'm just using the information given on the left hand side and putting it on the diagram in the right hand side. So MD is greater than MS. Here also this is to the right of the LM curve, and to the left of LM curve, MD will be less than MS. Here also MD will be less than MS. So what will happen if you happen to find yourself at a point like this in quadrant 3? What you would find, there will be, we are finding S is less than I. So when S is less than I, output will have a tendency to increase. Output will have a tendency to increase. This is Y, this is R. Whereas money demand is greater than money supply, so interest rate will have a tendency to increase. So when you are pulled by two forces in opposing direction, perhaps you will go to point, say from, so to say point Z. Okay, now what will happen if you are in at point Z? What happens? You are on the IS curve, but that means saving is equal to investment, but money demand is not equal to money supply because you are not on the LM curve. So what would happen, because money demand is not equal to money supply, interest rate will have a tendency to go up. That means you will come in quadrant 2. In quadrant 2, money demand is greater than money supply, so out interest rate will have a tendency to go up. But because you are in this quadrant, saving is now less than investment, so output will have a tendency to go down. Okay, output will have a tendency to go down. So maybe you will come to point this, say point say N. Now if you are finding yourself at point say at point R, what is happening at R? S is less than I. S is less than I means output will have a tendency to go down, and money demand is less than money supply, so interest rate will have a tendency to go down. So perhaps you will go in this direction. Okay, now if you traverse from different quadrants, how will you move towards point A? Broadly, you will traverse a path which will be, which I can represent as 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 traversing a S curve. Okay, so what is happening? You are traversing a S curve broadly. Okay, this you can try out on your own, taking different points in different quadrants. Broadly you will get a S curve, and that means the system is moving towards equilibrium following this kind of a path, which is taking the shape of a S curve. And I will give you some supplementary material from the book by Sapiro, where this has been discussed in some more detail, but I hope without that also you can make out what is going on in different quadrants and how the system is moving from one quadrant to another quadrant. Only at point A there is no inherent tendency for the system to deviate unless there is some exogenous development is taking place in the shape of, say, a monetary stimulus or a fiscal stimulus or a monetary contraction or a tight fiscal policy. I hope you have got the point.